Welcome everyone to the Hingham Historical Society and the Hingham Heritage Museum at Old Derby. My name is Deirdre Anderson and I have the pleasure to serve as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society, and I welcome you all to our second HistoryMaker program. And HistoryMaker is a program we developed to honor living Hingham citizens who've made an important historic contribution to our town. And what a thrill for us today to welcome Violet Nystrom Villani. She will be interviewed by our board member, Eileen McIntyre, and it's just a joy to see such a full house. After their presentation, which will include a bunch of visuals that Eileen has been working on very hard and conversations with Vi, we would welcome you all down to our museum shop on the first floor for refreshments. There's also an opportunity, if you haven't been into the museum yet, to see our exhibits on the second floor. The temporary, or not, our rotating exhibits are in the ballroom, and our inaugural exhibit is Boxes, Buckets, and Toys, the Woodenware of Hingham. And our permanent collection is in the Kelly Gallery, which is behind the glass doors you might have seen on your way up to the third floor. I'd also like to make you aware that virtually every weekend, it seems, we've had some programming at the Hingham Historical Society, so we welcome you back for future lectures. Next Saturday, we will welcome author Meg Ferris Kenny. If any of you remember Oliver and Rita Ferris, Meg is their daughter and has written a book called The House on School Street. It's about 7 generations living at 74 School Street in Center Hingham. So while today's exciting conversation will focus on South Hingham, next weekend we'll focus on Center Hingham. We also have a year-long lecture series going on titled The Spirit of Enterprise. And virtually every month we have a lecture on the industries and businesses that have made Hingham. Our next one is Sunday, November 4th, and it features a panel presentation with 3 executives from Talbot's. They're going to tell us how Nancy Talbot packaged bags in her garage with her friends and shipped sweaters all over the country into the company that it is today, employing over 3,000 people here in Hingham and 11,000 people nationwide. So that's Sunday, November 4th, and we'll have these downstairs. But without further ado, I would like to, on behalf of Eileen, who has spearheaded this project, present, on behalf of the Hingham Historical Society, Eileen worked with our representative, Joan Moschino, to present a proclamation. Be it hereby known to all that the Massachusetts House of Representatives offers its sincerest congratulations to Violet Nystrom Villani in recognition of your being honored as a Hingham HistoryMaker representing 94 years of living history. The entire membership extends its very best wishes and expresses the hope for future good, for fortune, and continued success in all endeavors. Signed by Robert DeLeo, Speaker of the House, and Joan Moschino, State Representative. Congratulations, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. I just have to say, I'm not a history maker. I'm just a person who's lived a long time and done a lot of things.
Thank you, Vi. I was actually hoping Deirdre would wait until the end because it can get overwhelming sometimes. So good afternoon. It is my privilege today to have a conversation with Violet Nystrom. I've been taking Finnish elocution lessons with Violet Nystrom Villani, whose life captures so many important moments and themes in Hingham's 20th century history. Thank you so much, Vi, for talking with me today. Through the lens of Violet's life experience, we are going to cover 4 topics concerning Hingham in the 20th century. First, the contributions of Finnish immigrants to our community and our country, particularly in the first half of the century. Then, life in Hingham during the Great Depression. We'll also talk about World War II, the impact it had on Hingham and on the life of one teenage Hingham girl. and will celebrate our community's appreciation of live music in many forms throughout the 20th century. For each topic, I will first provide some background information referencing maps, photos, other items that will be displayed on the slides, and then Violet and I will talk a bit. So here goes. You may wonder, as I did, why Finns were emigrating to America a century ago. A great migration of Finns to North America began in 1870, but intensified in the early years of the 20th century. A period of drought and widespread starvation was an important early driver, but Finns also left their homeland in large numbers for political reasons. After centuries of operating under Swedish rule, the Finnish provinces were under Russian control as a result of Russia's 1808-1809 war with Sweden. But it was only 90 years later, in 1899, that Russia began an aggressive campaign for the Russification of these provinces. Finns now were expected to speak Russian, to join the Russian army, and when they resisted, higher taxes were imposed. So many Finns left. When Finns arrived in the US, they often sought work in the mining or lumber industries in Michigan and Minnesota. But pockets of Finnish settlement also developed in New England, including in Quincy and Hingham. And as we'll see today, there was a strong connection between these two Finnish immigrant communities. Many Finnish men then worked in the quarries and in shipbuilding. Others were carpenters in home construction, stitchers in the shoemaking industry, or dairymen. There were many Quincy quarries then, and on the left here is an iconic shot of one of the large quarries in Quincy. Quarrymen here in the early 20th century would have included Finns as well as immigrants from Italy, Sweden, and elsewhere. Some Finns became quarry owners themselves, and in the photo, sorry it's a little bit fuzzy, but the photo on the upper right, we see Carl Winquist, or Winquist, which is a name that some people in Hingham may know, who formed the Common Quarry Company with his partner Oscar Djerf in 1902. In 1923, Carl and his wife Helga would move to Hingham, where he would run a dairy. More on that a little bit later. We probably all recall the name Thomas Watson from the story about the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. Remember, Mr. Watson, come here, I need you? Well, some of you may not know that after Watson left the telephone company, he founded the Fore River Ship and Engine Building Company, initially along the Fore River in East Braintree. The first customer was the US Navy, who ordered 2 torpedo boat destroyers in the late 1890s. By 1901, the yard had relocated and expanded at Quincy Point and was one of the largest shipyards in the US. One early customer of this Quincy shipyard was the Japanese Navy, which ordered 5 submarines for use in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The gift shop here in the museum has an interesting history of the Fore River Shipyard written by Wayne Miller, whose wife, Ellen, is very involved with the Historical Society here. Great book, I found it very useful. Finnish, as well as other recent immigrants living in both Quincy and Hingham, worked in the Fore River Shipyard in the early to mid 20th century. Now let's meet 2 Finnish immigrants who are key to the stories we will hear today. These are Violet's parents, August Nystrom and Ellen Rinna, in photographs taken before they each left Finland. August is shown with the trumpet he played then. He also was a singer, and at the time, I understand, had thoughts of a career in music. Ellen had been working as a servant since age 12, after her father died and her mother remarried. She also enjoyed singing, which may be how she and August met, in Helsinki. She traveled to the US in 1913, and August followed her in 1914. Ellen and August married in New York City just a month after August arrived. Ocean travel was a brave undertaking for these two 20-somethings in 1913 and 1914. First of all, the trip took almost 6 days, and they were almost certainly traveling in third class. But let's also quickly look at the history associated with the ships on which they traversed the Atlantic. First, Ellen. So the Olympic, a White Star Line ocean liner, was the first of 3 sister ships and had its maiden voyage in 1911. Less than a year later, in April of 1912, the second sister ship, the Titanic, was launched. As we all know, the Titanic would hit an iceberg and sink with considerable loss of life. So the Olympic was taken out of service twice for critical safety improvements, first adding more lifeboats, and secondly, improving below-deck engineering. Only a few months after this work was completed in 1913, Ellen boarded the Olympic to travel to New York. I don't think I could have done that. August crossed the Atlantic on the Cunard Line's ocean liner, the Lusitania. Yes, that Lusitania. War was already brewing when he boarded ship in April of 1914, and just 4 months later, Great Britain would declare war with Germany. In May of 1915, less than a year later, the Lusitania would be torpedoed by a German U-boat as it approached Liverpool. The ship was then carrying munitions as well as passenger luggage in the cargo hold, which may have caused the fatal secondary explosion, and more than 1,100 of the almost 2,000 passengers and crew died. After a short time in New York, the intrepid young couple moved to Massachusetts and settled in the Finnish-immigrant community in West Quincy, where August found work as a carpenter in home construction. The couple also sang together in a local chorus and acquired an upright piano. Their first apartment was at 41 Nelson Street, and we'll look at this map in a second, which is where they lived when a daughter, Solveig, was born in 1915. Sadly, this daughter would die of pneumonia at age 6 years old. There were no antibiotic treatments then. This was several years before the discovery and then development of penicillin. But let's look at this map for a minute and focus on a few streets, which you will hear more about on the next several slides. Thank you. So if you see this curved street here, this is Swami Road. And if you go over here and go down, this is Nelson Street, where Vi's parents first lived. And then if you turn here, that's Arthur Street. And that's where Vi lived, right at this corner here, when she was born. We'll talk about that in a second. While we're on the map, I just want you to follow Center Street. And over here is Albertina Street, which will come up a little bit later. But just think of this whole community, really, as the Finnish community, very largely Finnish immigrants living here. So in that building on Arthur Street, number 63 is where Violet was born in 1924. And by the way, I took that picture just a few weeks ago, so the building is still standing. Vi tells me that her family lived on the ground floor and that there was a store of some kind on the Nelson Street side, which is what you're seeing to the left of that corner building. So it's still there today. There's one, I mentioned Albertina Street, so we'll get to that in a second. Next slide. This is not an eye test, but it is a page from the 1930 census records, the one for Nelson Street in West Quincy, where Vi and her family were still living then. And the column that I will point to here. In those days, they were asking, where were you born? This is the column here. That column indicates that a large majority of the people on Arthur Street were of Finnish background, about half of the entries. There are also a few Swedish, Norwegian, and Italian immigrant households. The arrow on the upper left points to the information entered for Violet's household at 63 Arthur Street, and the entry indicates that Vi's father worked as a carpenter in home building. It also says that her mother was a housekeeper working for a private family. Here are some lovely shots of Violet Nystrom as a young girl, which makes a very good backdrop for some conversation with Vi. So Vi, let's talk first about the music that was so much a part of your life when you were very young in West Quincy. I just accidentally closed my, there we go. You've told me you began taking piano lessons at age 4, but tell me about music and performance in your life when you were very young then.
Well, of course, my father had a wonderful voice, and I used to sing with him when he went out to Swedish or Finnish affairs. And but the thing was, when my mother worked, of course, I had to stay with someone when I was such a young child. And I stayed with a family called the Newtonans, and they were very musical. One brother played an instrument, and I learned piano from one of the daughters, which was Helga Newtonen. And well, music was just part of my life. Other than going out and playing with all the kids in the neighborhood and playing cowboys and Indians.
And were you dancing as well?
Oh yes, I would go to the dances at the Finnish Hall, the Valley Hall, or I've forgotten the other hall. We had halls, we had saunas, we had everything up there. But yes, we learned to do the waltz, the schottische, the hambo, there's another Scandinavian dance. Anyone remember it? but we just enjoyed life.
And in fact, that must have been a very joyful time, but life was about to change. So hopefully music lifted some spirits in the hard times that arrived as the 1930s began. The stock market crash began on October 29, 1929, a date which came to be called Black Thursday. And when the Great Depression was at its worst in Massachusetts in 1934, about a quarter of the workforce was without a paying job, many for a year or more at that point. Many textile and shoe factories had closed, and the impact spread quickly through other industries. There was now no demand for new homes, and August Nystrom lost his job in 1932. But when August heard of a parcel of land in Hingham, perhaps from some Finnish friends who lived here, he cashed in a life insurance policy to buy it. He then built a modest 3-room bungalow with a 2-seater outhouse and a well with a hand pump out in the back. Well, President Roosevelt's New Deal included the Works Progress Administration, and the WPA established 3 work projects in Hingham. Vi's father, August, became a WPA carpenter working on a refurbishment project at the Naval Ammunition Depot that had existed since World War I. As many of you know, this depot was in the area that is now Bear Cove Park along the Back River. Vi, what do you recall about your family life during the Depression years you were living in Hingham?
Well, I was so young when we first got here. I survived as a kiddo, climbing trees and singing my music. I wasn't too well aware of it until I got a little older. And my mother worked as a housekeeper, and when I was going to school, I found that some of my classmates lived in those houses. So there became a pretty hefty class distinction between me and some of my classmates. When I was in the 4th grade, am I going ahead? When I was in the 4th grade, I got a solo to sing in one of the programs. That established me. It gave me something I had.
Now, I believe you also had a vegetable garden out in the back?
Oh, yes. Yes, my father had a vegetable garden, and we had chickens, and he used to bring the eggs to Quincy to sell to the Finnish people in Quincy. And we had a dog named Masu, whom my father taught. If a chicken got out of the fencing area, that dog chased the chicken, held it down gently, and my father would go over and get the chicken and put it back in the fence. So, and I climbed trees, and the vegetable garden, well, that kept us going, believe me.
Oh, that's lovely. I hadn't heard the story about the trained dog. That's great. So,
Sorry.
the Depression was still raging as 1935 approached, but the people of Hingham were determined to come together for a celebration in honor of the town's 300th anniversary. The extent of this multi-event, multi-day Tercentenary observation is only hinted at in the handful of photos shown on this and the next slide. There are many more images of this celebration in the Hingham Historical Society's digital archives. Violet, then a 10-year-old student in Hingham, joined some classmates in part of the Tercentenary pageant, which took place at what was called Pageant Field in Hewitt's Cove. This is where the World War II Hingham Shipyard would be built several years later. Violet, how wonderful that you saved your Tercentenary pageant costume and have now donated it to the Hingham Historical Society.
I never threw anything away.
And for your
My program,
participation in the
yes.
pageant, you also received a commemorative program that you saved.
A
It's
lot
lovely.
of familiar names in there.
I don't know if we have them out, but I know the Historical Society has a number of programs, but if you choose to see, and music, all kinds of things, invitations, tickets, it's amazing what they have in the archive here. Okay. So what do you recall, Vi, about the specific job that your group of children had in the pageant?
I don't remember anything except we were at the top of the hill. I think you saw the hill that we had to, and all I remember is running down the hill and screaming and yelling. That's all I remember of it.
Okay, learning to project so that you could be on stage in the future. Okay, now we can go. Okay, so now we're going to shed some light on Hingham's 20th century Finnville community. First of all, where was it? And I'll take the pointer. So this happens to be on the left, first of all, look at the map on the left. This happens to be a map from 2009, but Finnville is clearly labeled. Yeah. And it's really this stretch of Cushing Street between Ward and Whiting that was the heart of Finnville. There were some Finns also living over here on Ward Street, some on Gardner Street where Vi lived, so a smattering a little bit on Whiting and I think some on Derby, but really there was heavy concentration of Finns along here. Now, one reason perhaps that they settled there, and we'll talk about when they started to settle there, look at this 1903 atlas. The very edge here, and I've cut this map off, but this is some of the dense population on Main Street and up here on High Street. So you see Hingham had started to build out, but Cushing Street was pretty empty. So there was land available. So Finnville began as a community quite early in the 20th century, as documented in a book called Not All Is Changed, A Life History of Hingham, which is available in our museum shop here. This text conjures up an image of what life must have been like in the fairly rugged Finnville neighborhood before 1920. Listen to this. They made their community in the woods along Cushing Street. Like other immigrant groups, they came where the work was, and the work was at Plymouth Quarries on Whiting Street. As many of you know, there were quite a number of quarries around that area. There was a seam of a certain kind of granite that ran through there. I was also intrigued by the following excerpts from this book. In 1911, the Finns bought a few acres on Cushing Street at $35 an acre. And I have a theory about that land that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. They build cabins like modern pioneers. This really sounds like a pretty rugged life. This is again before 1920. I wonder if the geography of the area at that time, fairly untamed, might have reminded some of these settlers a bit of Finland. The area was heavily wooded. It was quite hilly then. It was before Cushing Street was flattened out a bit. And there was fresh water meandering through this part of South Hingham as there is today. The Plymouth and Eel Rivers and Cushing Pond not too far away. Again, an eye test, sorry about this. By 1940, Cushing Street had filled out quite a bit thanks to the influx of Finnish immigrants and their now growing households. And this page of data shows a portion of Cushing Street as it appears in the 1940 census. This column here, again, asking where were you born, is very heavily Finnish. In fact, all but one head of household listed here is Finnish born, and the one born in Ohio has a Finnish immigrant wife. Also of note in this column, where people were working, it's almost entirely shipbuilding. And in those days, that was the Four River Shipyard. So they were traveling back to Quincy for work. The shipyard was then owned by Bethlehem Steel, which had acquired it from Thomas Watson in 1913. Next slide. From the same 1940 census, here is a bit more of Cushing Street. Now the columns with arrows do tell a similar story, first of Finnish-immigrant concentration in head of household, and in this other one, a lot of shipbuilding. But there's other interesting points on this page. First, there's a group of 9 homes, which I bracketed. You can't see the bracket too well, but trust me, 9 homes right here that all have the same street address, 280 Cushing Street, but they're labeled A through I. This was a community of what started out as very simple cabins at that point on Cushing Street. And I have a theory that that might be the parcel that those Finns bought back in 1911, or a group of Finns bought it. I haven't totally connected the dots on that, but that's my theory at this point. One of the names here is interesting. Carl Headland is the name of this head of household here. I don't know if Bob made it. He's a busy mayor of Weymouth. But this is a relative of Bob Headland, and if I've got the genealogy correct, it's his first cousin once removed. It's his dad's first cousin. Bob's grandfather settled in Quincy, but his brother quickly moved to Hingham, and it's the descendants of the grandfather's brother who were living in Hingham. Bob's family was back on Swami Road in West Quincy, and that's where Bob Headland was born. He is very proud of his Finnish ancestry, and I know he was going to try and come today, but I'm going to share this with him. Okay, one other thing to mention there, yes, thank you for that, is one of the homes in that group of 9 is the Violet household. They were a 280A Cushing, and I know that in a second Vi is going to tell us a story about her experience of the Violet. So let's look quickly at a few more slides about Finnville, and then I'll chat with Vi about this interesting neighborhood. So first of all, this image takes us back to around 1918. It's a bit earlier in the build-out of Finnville, and it involves Finns who were living on Ward Street and High Street. What you're looking at is a Sunday school group outside the church that had been built by the black community of Tuttleville in the 19th century. Now, a portion of Ward Street, I know some of you here know about Tuttleville, a portion of Ward Street near High Street was then a largely black community with many residents employed in shoe and boot making. James King Tuttle, one of the early black residents, and his half-brother John Tuttle had led an effort to build the Free Christian Mission Church for the community in 1873. The church, also known as the Zion Hill Chapel at different points, was at the corner of Ward and High Street. In this Sunday school group photo, which in the archives has many Finnish names listed in the description in terms of the children there, it suggests that this historically black church had welcomed in the early 20th century, the new Finnish immigrants who were living nearby. And I'll point out 2 of the Tuttle children in the photo. Here is Norman Tuttle and Shirley Tuttle, surrounded by Finns. It's really a lovely little vignette. The church building, by the way, would later be sold and its steeple removed, and it was transformed to a dentist's office. The structure still exists today, and there's a plaque on it. Further along Ward Street, near what is now the Black Rock Golf Club, is a home that is owned today by Paul Vuori, with my Finnish explanation. Paul is the grandson of Edwin and Matilda Vuori. They are shown here on the right of the slide. On the left of the slide is a photo of Paul's grandfather driving an early 20th century automobile, and it's very fitting, if those of you know Paul know he's really into automobiles, so it's lovely that he has this photo of his grandfather. Edwin and Matilda had left Finland in 1907, and like the Nystroms, they first lived in the Finnish neighborhood of West Quincy, where Edwin was a cabinet maker and their 2 sons were born. Remember Albertina Street that I pointed out on that map? That's where the Vuoris had lived. The Violeys moved to Hingham in the 1930s, where Edwin and his son Edwin Jr. built a home on Ward Street. And shown here is basically the original footprint of the home that was built in 1939. You can see the stone there that says 1939. Paul tells me that the home originally had a typically Finnish sauna in the backyard. And I've read that when Finns built a home, the sauna was often the first thing completed. Paul also proudly showed me a stunning example of his Finnish grandfather's fine cabinetry work. And this is really an amazing piece of furniture. You see the glass doors and there's wooden doors. This actually now had a phonograph in it and speakers, but I don't know whether it was originally designed for that. It's just beautiful workmanship and beautiful wood, so he proudly has that in his home. One family we mentioned earlier were Carl and Helga Winquist, or Winquist, as many know the name here in Hingham. On this slide, we see the family's dairy after they moved in 1923 to High Street in Hingham. This dairy continued operations well into the 1950s, thanks to the large family who took over after Carl had died. One of the sons and his 7 siblings ran the dairy for some time. So now let's hear a bit from Vi about some of her memories of growing up as part of this Finnish community in Hingham. Let's begin, Vi, talking about that group of Finnish families on what is now Old County Road, in those cabins there. What do you recall about visiting the Viinakanens?
Well, we would go on Saturday night my parents had some friends, and we were invited over for coffee and nisu, which is Finnish coffee bread, and to use their sauna. So the couples would take their turns going in the sauna, and I would go with my mom and dad. And mind you, not like in the steam baths in this country where people wrap a towel around themselves. We went nude. I never noticed my parents because I did it from the tiniest little girl. So I was quite used to it. And until I got to be about 12 years old, we went to some of the saunas in Quincy, which were a business. And the owner came over to my father and said, you know, Gus, your daughter is 12 years old. Don't you think you ought to stop going to the sauna with her? So we did make arrangements, but I never noticed anything. And that's you know, you grow up a certain way and there's nothing brunchy about it. I think that was it.
Yeah, well, that's lovely. And I know you've also talked about sometimes there were celebrations in other parts of the South Shore where lots of Finns would get together.
Oh yes, they would, like at Huvila Park in Weymouth. I don't know if it exists anymore. I think there are houses built there now on the other side of Whitman's Pond. But places like that, we would have in the summertime big outings, picnics where the men competed in games and stuff. And my husband, later years when we went to them, he used to beat the Finns at horseshoes. And it didn't work out too well because he was Italian.
And we'll talk about Sam before too long. You also had milk delivery for a time from the Winquist Dairy. We didn't talk about that during the section on the Depression, but there was an interesting story about the town stepping forward to take care of...
They paid the milk bill so that I would have milk. And also, my father could go down to the town office and get underwear or whatever he needed for clothes to be able to work. The town was very, very good to the people.
So that's really lovely to think of the town stepping forward like that. So, and here's a picture of Vi at age 13. She's really shut up, and with her dog still, and her mom and her dad. And there's the vegetable garden that they had in the backyard. Her dad was hardworking. As you moved through the Hingham school system, you started meeting children from other parts of Hingham. Was it fun to meet new friends, and what was your life, how was it changing in those days?
Oh yes, because I met a lot more musicians. So I had a good time, and I just enjoyed school and people. And where I lived alone, and had lived alone with just my parents, having moved from a city where there were lots of kiddos around. I just enjoyed every friend that I made. And what can I say?
And you were formerly singing in some choirs and youth choruses?
Oh yes, as I was in the children's choir at the White Church. They called it the White Church. We don't anymore. At the Congregational Church. And when I was about, and also I went to the First Baptist Church on Sunday evenings where they had youth meetings. When I was 12 years old, I have to tell you, is it okay? When I was 12 years old, they asked me in the Congregational Church to sing Schubert's Ave Maria at their Christmas service, which I did. A few days later, she sang a Catholic song in our church. Well, you know, as an adult, I was singing in Protestant churches as a soloist after I got married. But I would go to church. I was at this point a Catholic. And I went up to the director at the Resurrection Church and said, I would love to sing Midnight Mass with you, because Midnight Masses are a beautiful service. And he heard me sing and he said, would you sing O Holy Night at our service? I said, I'd love to. So the next week I went to the rehearsal. He came over to me and he said, I'm afraid you can't sing it. Someone is complaining because you sing in Protestant churches. Now, I attended Mass faithfully. I went to the Protestant church and they paid me. I made some money. So I think times have changed. We have become very much more ecumenical, thank goodness, that each religion relates to the other.
Yeah, I think that's true. So is the next slide? Okay, so here in 1940, you see the Nystrom family, and they are at the same address, and you see that Vi's father is still working as a carpenter at the WPA, so he's still 1940, still has that Depression-era job. And next slide. So things are about to change. News traveled slower in 1941. I'm not sure if Vi had a full understanding of what had happened that Sunday at Pearl Harbor when she headed for school the next day as a high school senior, Monday morning, December 8th. What happened?
We were all called into the auditorium. They turned on the radio, and we heard Franklin Delano Roosevelt say,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Thank you, Frank. So, in April of 1942, next slide, August is working at the Four River Shipyard now, and he registered for the draft as he was required. He was then 50. He did not get called up, most likely though because of the importance of his work at the shipyard, which was quickly churning out ships. Some of Violet's classmates and her Finnville neighbors would enlist ahead of high school graduation though. And as a high school senior in the class of 1942, Violet found opportunities to volunteer right here in Hingham, both as an air raid warden, and she had a helmet just like this, and as a USO hostess. So I know there were some blackout rules. What was your job as air raid warden? Do you recall anything about that?
well, if there were an air raid, we would hear the sirens blow, and I had to check my section of the street to make sure that no windows were showing light. But fortunately, I never had to do it. We were very lucky.
Yeah. And you were a USO hostess, so you're a high school senior. What did that entail?
Well, we were selected. Someone came to the school and picked certain students, and we became USO hostesses. We were picked up in a van, escorted to Prospect Street, where there were two Army groups, an infantry group and combat engineer group. And we were taken to the hall and we danced with the soldiers. End of the evening, back in the van and home. We were watched very carefully because, well, we weren't old enough yet to be dating anyone. Of course, there was a cornfield. That the boys learned how to creep through, sneak through, to go to any girl's house that was close by. And there was a gas station on the corner, Army gas station on the corner of Whiting and Gardner Street. So going from Prospect Street to get their gas, they would be going by my house, and they learned about how good my mother made coffee. We had more coffee drinkers coming over. They didn't come over to see me, they came over to get my mother's coffee.
Now, there's a home shown in the upper left-hand corner that'll be familiar with people who drive on Main Street. And there were some USO dances there as well?
Oh, yes. And of course, there were not just the boys from Camp Hingham. There were service people from other countries landing. There were some English sailors, I think they were. And I was talking with one of them. Couldn't understand him at all. I had the worst time. But we danced well. We danced well.
Now, you mentioned that camp on Prospect Street and some dances you went to there. Mm-hmm. Did you meet someone there?
Yes. Someone who learned to go through the cornfield. No, he really didn't. But I would meet him all the time and enjoyed so much dancing. It was Sam Villani from New York. And when he was transferred to Fort Devens from Hingham, we got married.
We're getting just a little ahead of ourselves, but what was there a dance that Sam taught you? I thought you knew all the dances, but was there one he taught you?
Oh no, he taught me how to jitterbug. I mean, that turned me on, really.
So with all of this war as backdrop, it's really kind of innocent to see this next slide, which is the page from Vi's high school yearbook.
Not
Actually,
mine.
it's
somebody else's
It's a
book.
friend's, yeah. So you
Because I've written on
you'd
that.
autographed it to your
Yes.
friend. So it's wonderful to see that this little Violet who had danced and sung with her dad at the Finnish and Swedish festivals has now taken advantage of every opportunity to hone her craft in singing, playing the piano, and in acting. Really a full preparation for what many of us know Vi for over the years. So wonderful to see that. And there's kind of an innocence about it too when you think about all this war surrounding this time. Now what does Winky mean, Vi?
I don't know, I just had a habit of winking.
So that became your nickname among your friends.
I
And
did it too
when you
much.
signed that autograph to your friend, you actually signed it Winky. So I guess that was your nickname. We can go to the next slide. So you mentioned that Sam proposed when he got to Fort Devens. He missed you, I guess. And so it's just a year later, 1943. He's still a young woman here. And this is the chapel at Fort Devens. It's a postcard version of it, so it's really lovely. Where you got married to Sam. And I love this picture of Vi and Sam. The style that women had in the 1940s, someone was asking Vi today how long it took to do your hair.
Well, I had a lot of hair, so once I fixed it, it stayed. But we had to have gloves, and you had to have a hat. I had a very light little thing on my head. I didn't like hats.
Now, as a newly married couple, you lived in married couple housing at Fort Devens, but you didn't have much time together before Sam moved to a base in New Jersey later that year to prepare for his deployment. Sam Villani's 204th Engineer Combat Battalion. We have this plaque that Vi showed me. That's how I knew exactly the number, 204th Engineer Combat Battalion, First Sergeant Samuel A. Villani. They departed from New York on January 2nd, 1944. Interesting, they were on the Queen Elizabeth, which was another ocean liner that was used for troop transport. Obviously, this is not Sam's unit here. This is probably British or Australian troops in this particular vintage photo. But that's the way he got over initially to Scotland, where they would train for the D-Day invasion. So with Sam overseas, Violet Nystrom Villani now had moved back with her parents in Hingham. What did you then decide to do?
Well, he wasn't around. I was going to be lonely. I had to be busy. So he didn't want me to work. This was one of the things he said when we got married. I don't want you to have to work. I'll take care of you. But he sent money to me every month from his salary. But I had to do something. And a neighbor on my street said, would you like to work down the shipyard? I said, anywhere. Though they offered me a job in an office, I said, nothing doing. I don't want to sit at a desk all day. So an opening came for on the swing shift from 3 to 7, which takes care of evening hours, as a push-button crane operator. Now this is rather interesting. It was a huge section of the shipyard, and there were railing track on either side of the building. Then there was a track going across which moved back and forth on these first tracks. And from that track, a cable came down with 6 buttons on it, which I controlled. I had to pick up these huge, I didn't, the crane did, pick up these huge sheets of metal and pick them up, and I'd have 2 men that guided it, because it was hanging free, would guide it over to a machine, drop it carefully on the machine. It would a big punch, and it would put an overlap on the edge of the sheet of steel, so that when they were on the ship side of the ship, it was absolutely smooth. And then, of course, I had to pick that up and put it to another spot where it would be later taken to be used. That was hard work. I had to wear a hat, wear pants, steel-toed shoes, metal-toed shoes, and I walked on concrete all day. It was not easy. So crane operators that can sit down in their crane have a lot better time. But that was my job in the shipyard.
And it was very cold there.
Oh, yes, of course, the steel mill. We'd have the winter time. It was very, very cold, and there was like a refrigerator in there. You know, when the heat goes off, you know how things get cold. The thing was, the next day it would get warm. The steel mill was ice cold for days. That steel just kept it cold. It wasn't easy.
So you wore gloves and warm hat.
Yes.
And I know there were a number of women working in the shipyard. Were any of them in your area?
No, none that I know of, no.
So as you've explained to me, it was kind of an isolated building because it's kind of dangerous with these big sheets of steel moving around. So you and the 2 guys, and And how were you treated? How did you feel about working with these two guys?
Well, this was just one section of the building, because the other sections, they were building these ships right inside there and then taking them out, or building them sections inside. What was your question?
So you were just working with two men?
Yes.
One of the boys, I guess, huh?
No.
But you were comfortable?
Yes.
Aside from being
Because there were a
very
lot of
cold.
people all around.
Yeah. So I just want to make a point about the shipyard, because there's some wonderful pictures here, these two slides. Right before Vi had joined the shipyard, it was recognized for its amazing accomplishment of producing 227 ships in 3.5 years. The shipyard was awarded an E for Excellence designation, and the women who worked at the shipyard in 1943 received pins for contributing to that effort. This next slide, when Vi was talking about the steel coming in, it came in on a rail spur that then ran along Beale Street. I think some of those tracks, a little bit, are still there. That rail spur ran along Beale Street specifically for this purpose. And then there was a piece that headed right into the shipyard, roughly where Fresh Market is now, is the best I can figure. It actually went under Lincoln Street. Lincoln Street was elevated then. So that's the rail spur going into the shipyard, and that would be bringing these pre-cut sheets of steel that would come into the steel mill that Vi was working in. So I suspect that Violet did not hear very regularly from Sam after he deployed. The 204th Engineer Combat Battalion was very busy and in harm's way as it supported the Third Army from the beaches of Normandy through Central Europe. Sam would earn a Bronze Star for heroism along the way. And by the way, it was the famous General George S. Patton that commanded the U.S. Third Army from right after D-Day through France and deep into Germany. Peace would come in Europe when Germany surrendered to the Allied forces in May of 1945, and you see on the left troops celebrating in Paris. But Sam's unit had more work to do. They went on to Nuremberg, and here's a picture of a really devastated Nuremberg because of all the bombing of the war. They were sent there to prepare some housing and other structures in advance of the Nuremberg war trials that were going to take place. So they were already working towards that. So Vi, it was months later, because of that work he was doing. Yes. So Vi meets Sam's ship in Boston. I first went, we'll hold this.
Okay.
You went into Boston to meet Sam's ship. Now, obviously, there was no email or texting back then. So how did you know when his ship was coming in?
The newspaper always gave listings of all the ships that were coming in from overseas. And Sam's was coming to Boston, so I flew into Boston for that day. They were telling when it was going to be in there. And you know how the wharves are, there's that big water in between. Okay, I was able to go on one wharf, and because I couldn't go on the wharf that his ship was coming on. It was over on the other side. So I stood on the edge of the thing, and when the guys came out on deck, I'm shouting across the water. I had a big voice, shouting across his name across the water, and finally he came to the side of the deck and waved to me. And then when they did get off, I was able to see them coming from wherever they came in the building. And so when he came up, I ran over to him. Of course, we kissed. And all the other guys says, "Ah."
I asked Vi to bring this plate because I was really touched by it. The duty that Sam had in Nuremberg exposed him to this real horrible devastation in the city. But he brought back this beautiful plate, and all around it are structures, probably many of which were no longer standing or were really severely damaged. So it's really a touching memento of a Nuremberg that was no longer really visible, except on this plate that Vi has held on to. So Vi, you must have been so grateful that Sam had arrived home and intact when so many did not. Did Sam tell you what he'd done to earn that Bronze Star?
Yes, they were camped on in some wooded area near a big field. and suddenly a German German airplane came swooping down towards them. Sam ran across the field to the guns and fired and got the plane to leave. So he got his, I think he was slightly wounded. They were going to, he said they were going to give him the, what is that? Purple Heart. But he said, I don't want it. I don't deserve it. I wasn't wounded. Give it, let the wounded ones really deserve it. But he worked for that.
He definitely did.
Can I say another thing?
Yeah.
The thought that just crossed my mind. He was a first sergeant. And they offered him to upgrade him to lieutenant. And he said, no, I do not want to be an officer. I want to be with my men.
So post-war, peacetime in Hingham, you and Sam lived for a short time with your parents in their home at 136 Gardner that now had been expanded with indoor plumbing.
Yes.
And Sam had joined the Carpenters Union and was working in construction. I know he got to be in kind of a management position for that union over time. You now had time together to start a family, contributing to that post-war baby boom in the US that began in 1946, which was the year that your first child, Stephen, was born. Your wartime work and your savings when Sam was away, because you worked at the shipyard, you saved all those checks he sent home, that allowed you and Sam to make a down payment on a piece of property right next door to your parents at 140 Gardner. And thanks to the GI Bill that had been passed by Congress in 1944, Sam was eligible for a low-interest GI mortgage. Your dad helped Sam get the foundation finished for the house, and when August died suddenly, Sam's friends in construction helped get the initial footprint of your new home built, which is the part on the right was the initial footprint of the home. So you're now settled in as a family, growing your family. But as you settled into your new home, I know Sam loved one of his mother's Italian recipes, and he proceeded to cook it for you. Tell me about that.
Well, yes, he did a nice job. He made spaghetti and meatballs. And my being Finnish, I didn't know how to cook any Italian food. And it was delicious. But what a mess he made. So I said, if I've got to clean up this mess, I'm going to learn how to cook the meal. And I learned. So he didn't have to do it anymore.
So your home very quickly had become a 3-generation home because after your dad died, your mother, Ellen, came and lived with you. More Villani children arrived, and you and Sam would expand your home after your 4th child, Sam Jr. or Tony, was born. So as Violet raised her children, she also found time to contribute to the many forms of live music that made homes and communities hum through so much of the 20th century. Vi joined the Hingham Civic Chorus, as well as other groups, after the war. In its early years, the chorus often performed with the Hingham Civic Orchestra, another post-World War II community organization devoted to live music performance. We have some posters here on the table of orchestral performances for children, where Vi was featured as the narrator. This orchestra, the Hingham Civic Orchestra, built on a tradition going back to the Hingham Community Band that had been founded in the first decade of the 20th century. I encourage you to stop in the Kelly Gallery on the 2nd floor if you haven't been there. There's this wonderful bass drum from that early 20th century band. It says Hingham Community Band on the side. The Hingham Civic Orchestra evolved, and in its current form is the all-professional Atlantic Symphony Orchestra, which began its current season just last night with a performance. Now, the Hingham Chorus that you joined in the 1940s after the war also had some pre-World War II roots. Tell us about that.
Yes, in the Tercentenary they had a chorus, of course, and those people enjoyed singing together so much they formed the Hingham Civic Chorus. And they did perform for a number of years until the war came along and they disbanded. Then after the war in 1948, they decided to start up again. And it wasn't long before, I think the second year, that a lot of the people wanted to perform, and many people loved Gilbert and Sullivan. So we went to doing a concert in the fall and a Gilbert and Sullivan in the springtime. Of course, there were some people that loved to sing the Gilbert and Sullivan but wouldn't get up on stage and act. So we had a pit chorus. We had an orchestra and a group of about 10 to 12 people that sang all the choral numbers with the people on stage. What more can you ask for?
Go to the next slide. So that Hingham Civic Chorus then went on to become a musical theater organization beyond Gilbert and Sullivan. And Violet would not only sing, but act with a decades-long run of leading lady roles for Hingham Civic Music Theater and other community theater groups on the South Shore. And this is a publicity still from when she was in The King and I with the Old Colony Theater. So Vi, you have given audiences such joy over the decades. I know it's a lot of work, though. What draws you to the stage?
The fact that when I go out on stage, it's not me. I was always very nervous, and I stood out in the wings, never talked to anyone. They probably thought I was a snob, but I was so nervous, I couldn't talk to anybody. And as soon as I stepped on that stage, that character was using my body, and I swear my being stood in the wings. And I decided that I would never want to play a criminal, a killer, or an insane person, because I always got so into the role. I loved the acting. And I just think I love being somebody else other than me. I think that's the bottom line.
Well, you told me you also were inspired when you were a very young girl on a trip to New York with your dad.
Oh yes, when we were singing various places throughout New England, it was Finnish places. My dad got an offer to go to New York to sing. And I says, oh no, I'm not going to New York. That's a long ride, and that was before radios in the cars. So my father says, well, tell you what, if you do this with me, I'll take you to Radio City Music Hall. I was thrilled about that, and I saw my first musical. And when I saw that musical, I said, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be an actress and a singer.
So okay. In addition to your leading lady singing roles, you've been stage director of many shows. We've got a bunch of posters here, quite a number of shows. Do you have a favorite role or show, either that you've acted and sung in or that you've directed?
Well, I love them all, but I think Kate in Kiss Me, Kate, Anna in The King and I, in which you, my youngest son, was my son in one of the productions. And there's another one I've forgotten now. There was a third one I liked very much, plus Naughty Marietta. I can't remember the third one.
So you told us how you dreamed of being a star from that moment with your dad in New York. But I have to say, you've certainly found your calling by bringing a bit of Broadway to Hingham and other communities of the South Shore. You were so rightfully honored for decades of wonderful performances and behind-the-scenes work by the Hingham Civic Music Theater at their 70th anniversary gala just in September. So brava! And how delightful today that your 4 children and some of the extended Villani family are here to appreciate their mom and their grandmother. We know that Sam Sr. is here in spirit very much as well. We would like to thank all of the extended Villani family for continuing to share Violet with Hingham and the South Shore community. On behalf of the Hingham Historical Society, it is my great pleasure. Can we Just advance the slide one. If you missed that on the way in. You family members have to get a shot of that with your mom on your way out. So it's my great pleasure to honor you today, Violet, as a Hingham HistoryMaker. And now I think Deirdre has something to close.
Well, thanks, but thank you so much, Violet and Eileen. That was fabulous. What a wonderful treat. And I needed a little stage direction that I was supposed to do this at this point in the program. But are you open to taking some questions?
Yes. Yeah, sure. If there are questions in the audience, I think we share the microphone back and forth.
Hi, Vi. It's Diane DiNapoli from the other side of Gardner Street. This was amazing, and I've always kind of wanted to hear some of your stories, so this was a great opportunity to hear them. I found your stories of obviously being a woman just amazing how it might have changed from meeting. Sorry, I'm from New York, so I talk very fast, but I will slow down. Can you just tell me sort of your history and how it's changed being a woman back? Obviously, when your husband told you he didn't want you to work, but you did work. I was curious how he felt and just how you see it's changed for women. Thank you.
I really don't have any definite answer. I admire the women that are standing up today. I think that women were just housekeepers way back in my day. And take care of the children and do the dishes and this, that, and the other thing. And I think there's some very brilliant women that have come along, and they should speak up. Sorry, guys.